What's up, everybody? What's up, MGTOW? So I wanted to do a response video to one of Stardust's most recent videos titled A Matter of Deracination. And in the video, he was posing the question of why black people in the United States seem not to want to take quote-unquote white paths of success. And in doing so, he presented the argument of deracination, or having a lack of a centralized culture or an originating culture in the context of immigration. Now, while I do think that this does play a factor into black people's lack of quote-unquote white success, I think that the question might be slightly misplaced as well. Because to me, is it a question of deracination, or is it a question of disintegration or deintegration? So if one looks at the question rather than a case of blacks taking white paths of success, rather than a question of why haven't blacks integrated into the greater society of North America, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. And I've kind of broken it down into three general categories. The first being the most obvious, of course, phenotypical. And then the second being location and time. And the third being exclusion. And the reason why I'm kind of not arguing against his deracination point, but trying to add these extra categories, is because while deracination might be a part of why black people don't take quote-unquote white paths of success, I find the argument kind of hard to accept as the main reason, because, I know a lot of people from different cultures and different immigrant cultures, mainly Irish and Italian immigrant cultures, and a lot of those people, they don't speak Italian at all, and in fact, I know more about Irish culture than most of my Irish friends do. Like, I had to explain to them what mech means, because they didn't know what it meant. So, while that might play a part, while deracination might play a part, I think that the elephant in the room, of course, is phenotype. And you can look at phenotype even in a more expanded view, and what would classically be known as archetype. Because whether you want to look at it from a genetic standpoint or a cultural standpoint, there are just different types of black people than there are of white people. And even though populations might express similar types, the ratios in which those types are expressed are definitely offset in each of the different communities. And this is definitely a unique problem to black people. Because, for instance, a Jewish person could move to the United States, and then they could just change their name from Rosenstein to Rose, and then name their kid Charlie, and no one would be the wiser in the larger population that they weren't, maybe English or Irish or Scottish or something like that, unless they did a genetic test. And we can see this now, that this is one of the problems that the alt-right is having, where they have to actually do genetic tests and post their genetic results to make sure that there's not any Jewish people joining the alt-right. Because I really doubt that they're doing the genetic testing to figure out if a person is black or not. So, of course, the phenotypical features present a huge problem when it comes to integration. It pretty much stops integration altogether, because the groups are automatically going to see themselves as separate groups. which, like I said, for instance, an Italian immigrant can change their name from Consigliere to Connors, and no one would know the difference. And also, based on just natural instincts and the historical context, if you believe in genetic memory or epigenetics, that there were constant tribal battles between the Europeans and the Africans, which in the case of East Asians or Asians, that conflict didn't really exist, and at least not for as long of a period as it did between the Africans and the Europeans. So there may or may not be some genetic memory or epigenetic effects that cause Africans and Europeans to distrust each other, among other things. And also, looking still at phenotype, the African and European phenotype is actually closer than we'd like to admit. Because if you compare some of the physical characteristics of Europeans and Africans to East Asians, there are some stark differences. There are differences in stature and athletic ability, and especially if you're looking more into history before the Industrial Revolution, the athletic ability and stature of Africans would have made them quite a formidable threat to Europeans, of course, until the time when Europeans had guns and stuff like that. And so, while in the case of East Asians or Asians, they might not be said to have integrated into white society, but at the same time, from my opinion and just observation, it seems as though East Asians are not looked at as a threat, that Africans are looked at as a threat by Europeans. And also, still going with the archetype kind of wider view, you have different personality types, in a sense, in the African population and the European population. Of course, this is more based on genetics and, seasonal evolutionary theories or what have you, if you believe in evolution. And from that comes different, types of people. And then adding into that the higher levels of testosterone and all that other stuff, it just makes it very difficult for black people to want to be a part of white culture or the majority culture, what have you. And then on top of it, you just have the outward appearance and historical factors that make it so that it's very difficult for white people and black people to trust each other and to get along just on a most basic instinctual sense. And so the second point is about location and time. Now, looking at the different time periods in which people immigrated to the United States seems very important when you're talking about integration into society. And depending on the group or where the group came from, for example, taking the Jewish immigrants, for example, that they were actually leaving a place in which they were persecuted to come to the United States. And similarly, even though Irish and Italian immigrants were treated poorly when they arrived in Ellis Island at New York, a lot of those people were already low-class people with not a lot of opportunities in Europe at the time anyway. So it was like they were trading one shitty situation for another shitty situation with a possibility of advancement. Whereas if you take that in contrast with the African situation, Africans or black people are still in the same country, and it's the exact same government that was in place at the time when they were enslaved. So, for instance, I mean, you could make similar parallels to the Moorish invasion into Europe, but Europeans were able to fight back against the Moors and eventually get the Moors out of Europe for the most part. I mean, there might be some question about some Spanish people and some Italian people, but that's for another video. And also, if you look at not only the time period, but the length of time in which African ancestors have been in the United States, it's much longer period than most of the other, I don't know how to put this, but I guess kind of oppressed European classes of people, because the English and the Germans and the Dutch came over here at a time when they had a huge advantage over the native population, and they were able to stake out land and basically set up land for free and do all that type of stuff. And then, like I was saying before, because of the phenotype, Irish and Italian immigrants were easily able to mix in with the current populations that were already there. And then, so if you look at the length of time and, of course, the time period, it's going to, create a kind of a separation between white people and black people. And like I said, there are very few people, except for people that are still in countries that are being, oppressed right now in that sense, that live in the same country that they had bad things happen to them. Like, for instance, the Irish have been able to regain some semblance of independence from Britain, at least Southern Ireland has. And even Germany has pretty much remained independent after World War II. Granted, there are United States military bases in Germany, and their military is definitely suppressed. But for the most part, the United States didn't invade and take over the government of Germany. I mean, it's still run by German people and German-speaking people. So it's just another very difficult situation in which, not much can be changed about it, because there's nowhere really for black people to go but the United States. And so this last point, I think, speaks most to what Stardust was talking about deracination and the lack of taking, quote-unquote, white paths of success. And that's the idea of exclusion. Because black people were excluded from the greater society for such a long period of time, after a while, you just start to develop your own culture and develop your own exclusionary forces. For instance, I mean, a lot of people say that black people are taking back the N-word for many reasons. One might be to take the power away from the word, or one might say it's just a recognition that that word was used, almost a reminder to, remember that period of time. But I also think that the way in which it's used is it's used as an exclusionary device. Because what's the main kind of premise of the N-word? That white people aren't allowed to use it. White people are excluded from using the N-word. And a lot of black culture is centered around excluding white people. So it's not so much that black people aren't trying to follow, quote unquote, white passive success, but it's more that black people just want to exclude white people completely from their social circles in the same way that they were excluded from the mainstream of society for quite some time. And I think that this exclusionary force, however you want to look at it, is definitely a big part of the reason as to why black people don't do the same things as white people, and why black people don't want to take quote-unquote white paths of success is because of this exclusionary factor. And like I said, the other factors do factor heavily into why black people would want to do this, even if it's at the point of their own detriment. But it does seem to be a huge factor, along with the other factors, as to why black people don't want to or are not able to include themselves in the greater society and the greater success that society has. Because, like I said, the deracination argument does make sense, and it definitely does play a factor. But to say that black people don't have any connections with Africa or don't understand African culture is not entirely true. Because at the same time as people want to make fun of the we was kings type of people, also known as the conscious community, a lot of these people have a much deeper understanding of African culture than your average European person. For instance, a presenter like Brother Polite, say what you want about him, but he has a high level, I would say mastery level skill of Egyptian hieroglyphics, Egyptian culture, and Egyptian philosophy, which is more than you can say about the average white person that's not a history major. I mean, ask a couple European people about a few wars that happened in Europe, and they probably won't be able to tell you much about it. Ask them about some of the cultural things from the culture that they came from, and they probably won't be able to tell you much about it. And so it does seem as though the phenotypical problem and, of course, the location and the length of time that black people have been here and what they've gone through within that length of time has led to an exclusionary attitude towards white people. Because, I mean, it's just a unique circumstance, and I don't really want to sound like I'm complaining or trying to say anything bad about white people, because, I mean, most white people didn't have anything to do with it. But, I mean, at the same time, you have to look at it from a historical context. You know, for instance, my grandfather went and fought in World War II in France, and then when he came back to the United States, he had to sit on the back of the bus. And then my dad went to Vietnam, and then when he came back, and he still had to fight for civil rights in his own country. So, it's kind of like, I think that black people either willingly want to exclude themselves, or they feel excluded from quote-unquote white paths of success, and because of that, they've created their own subculture in which they can use their own phenotypical and archetypical traits to gain some level of success and create an alternate hierarchy, in a sense, that excludes white people and excludes other races that are seen favorably by white people. So, yeah, I mean, that's just my thoughts on it. I'm sure people have a lot of different ideas and answers to this question, but like I said, I'm just not sure if Stardust was just trying to be political or civil in the asking of the question, but, if it's the question of just taking white paths of success or actually being somewhat accepted or integrated into the society, I think that those questions are similar, and if you look at it from an integration standpoint, it becomes more clear as to why it's almost not possible and the reasons why black people might want to exclude themselves from partaking in what they would view to be white activities. And I mean, I could go on about this for a long time, and I really didn't mean to do a bunch of videos on racial issues, but I just wanted to respond to Stardust's video in a timely fashion. So yeah, that's all I got for this one. Have a good day and go MGTOW.